Greetings, folks. Welcome back to a city full of history. My name is Dan Thurber. I am your four-eyed, blue-brimmed, camera-toting history repeater, and today on the show, I'm going to be straight with you, folks. The story I have for you today is kind of ridiculous. It is. There's really no two ways about it. If I were sitting in a movie theater and I saw this story up on the big screen, I'd probably leave thinking, that was a great ride, but that was a bit much, don't you think? Anyway, they say truth is stranger than fiction, and today's story is certainly evidence of that fact. The year was 1780, October, and George Washington, he had a problem. You see, Benedict Arnold, decorated officer, general, hero of the Battle of Saratoga, had just defected to the British, and Washington didn't know how far down the rabbit hole it went. Morale in the army was certainly low, and no one knew if any other officers were involved. For help with these problems, Washington turned to one of his most trusted subordinates, Major Henry, aka Light Horse Harry Lee, and together the two of them would set in motion one of the most ridiculous, happenstance-laced tales in the American Revolution.
We're getting out of the library and onto the street. It really is a city full of history. You just have to go out and find it. On the 13th of October, 1780, Washington wrote to Lee, saying he wished to discuss a particular piece of business, that is, a way to bring Arnold back to face justice. The plan Lee devised sounded a bit ridiculous, like something straight out of a Cloak and Dagger novel. A soldier would defect to the British, infiltrate British-controlled New York City, kidnap Arnold, and sail him back across the river. Washington was willing to take the risk, and instructed Lee to find someone who could pull off such an outlandish plan. A week later, Lee wrote Washington saying he had just the man for the job, a sergeant of his regiment by the name of John Champe.
Now, we don't know too much about Champe. He was from Loudoun County, Virginia, and was born about 1756, making him more or less 24 when all of this happened. Lee gave him his highest recommendation, describing the man as having tried courage and inflexible perseverance. He was originally hesitant to accept his mission, though. On the one hand, he was very patriotic, devoted to the American cause, and was well aware of the good his mission would accomplish. On the other hand, in order to really sell it to the British, he'd have to really sell it to the Americans. He would really have to defect, and it was something that he struggled with. Ultimately, the promise of promotion and the knowledge of the good service he would be accomplishing and performing for his country won out, and John Champe began to make preparations for his midnight ride.
On the night of October 20th, Champe was called to Lee's quarters and told tonight was the night. Champe went back to his regiment and slipped away with his horse and the regiment's orderly book and began the long journey south. Champe managed to make it out of camp unseen, but unfortunately ran into a patrol half a mile south. Unable to account for his being out so late, Champe spurred his horse on, quickly evading the pursuing patrol. The patrol, as it turned out, was of Lee's regiment, and word quickly got back to Lee that one of his men had fled. Lee attempted to drag his feet as much as he could to give Champe the best possible chance of escaping, ordered the regiment be assembled to determine if the rider was in fact one of theirs. Word quickly came back that it was their own sergeant, John Champe. Lee again stalled as much as he could, but eventually had to send out a detail in pursuit. Through the night they raced after Champe, assuming first that he would head toward Paulus Hook on the Hudson, the easiest point to try and cross into New York. Champe instead chose to head west towards Bergen, where it was known that 2 British galleys were currently lying.
Now, Bergen, New Jersey no longer really exists, but it was thereabouts. It was absorbed into Jersey City back in 1870. Now, all of the accounts of Champe's ride seem to agree that he met up with 2 British sailing vessels that were anchored a few miles west of Bergen. And the only body of water that really fits that bill is right out there. That is Newark Bay. We're on a bridge right now up over the Hackensack River, right where it meets the bay, a little bit west of Bergen. So it seems likely this was about the spot that this all went down. Now, early in the morning, British sailors on board those ships looked up towards the shoreline, hearing quite a commotion. they saw a single rider emerge from the woods in very much of a hurry. Shortly thereafter, they spied a unit of American cavalry chasing the man, and it didn't take them too long to put two and two together. The British sailors opened fire on the cavalry unit to cover Champe's escape. None of the cavalry were injured, but they did pull back, giving Champe enough time to dive off his horse and into the water. A few minutes later, he was pulled out of the drink by awaiting British arms. To stay on Champe's trail, we have to head back into New York. You see, after the British pulled Champe out of the drink, they sent him to go see General Sir Henry Clinton, the commanding officer in charge of the British forces. Now, Clinton wanted to verify his story, and he must have been pretty impressed with Champe. You see, Champe originally thinking he was going to have to sneak into New York and hunt around, look for Arnold, try and get into his good graces. But after his interview with Clinton, Clinton actually sent Champe to go find Arnold. You see, Arnold had been put to work by the British to recruit primarily American defectors for a unit that would be under his command, and Champe fit the bill to a T. Over the next few weeks, Champe worked closely with Arnold and began to put his plan together. You see, at the time, Arnold was staying at a place called the King's Arms, a tavern overlooking Bowling Green. Now, Bowling Green's behind me, so the King's Arms would have been right about there. Now, behind the King's Arms Tavern was a garden, right about where Greenwich Street is today, over there. Behind the garden was the waterfront. It was a lot closer than it is today. Now, Champe knew that every night Arnold would go for a walk through this garden alone. So that was where he resolved to kidnap him. He'd snatch him from the garden, carry him down to the waterfront, where he would have a Confederate waiting. The two of them would get him into a boat and row across the Hudson to where Lee would be waiting on the other side with a detachment and some horses. Champe got word back to Lee that this was the plan. The night came, Lee was down waiting with his horses, and Champe never showed up. Now, Lee was pretty distraught about Champe's disappearance, but they were still at war, and the war moved on. By the next summer, the theater of the war had largely moved south. In July, a bearded, bedraggled man made his way through the American lines in North Carolina and introduced himself as Sergeant John Champe. Lee rushed to the man. Recognizing his sergeant, he was overjoyed that he was alive and desired to know his tale. Champe said that only a few days before he was set to kidnap Arnold, he was sequestered on board a British man-of-war in New York Harbor, ready to move south with the American Legion. Once they landed in Virginia, Champe stayed for a few weeks before finally getting his opportunity to defect again, this time for real. He lived in the hills, making his way south, back into the American lines, where he was reunited with his major. Washington was overjoyed that Champe was alive, although couldn't recognize the plot formally. Lee did let the men know where Champe had been, so that there was no ill will on that front. Champe wanted to return to active service, but Washington wouldn't let him. Washington felt that if the British captured him, he'd be hung as a spy, and he was probably right. Champe got on a horse with the thanks of a grateful nation and rode off into the history books. Okay, well, see, that's not close. Not exactly true. You see, Champe actually didn't just ride off and disappear into the history books. What actually ended up happening requires us to take a field trip just a little further afield than New Jersey. I think that was... We're a little ways from New York right now. Actually, we're in northwestern Virginia. And the reason that we're in northwestern Virginia, standing out here in the middle of February, is because we're tracking down the story of a British officer after the Revolution. Now, this was an excerpt that was from the diary of a certain Captain Cameron. It was first posted in a British periodical called the United Service Journal in 1840, which was after Captain Cameron's death. We don't really know what Captain Cameron's first name was. Supposedly it was Angus, but it's proving difficult to track down. Now, Captain Cameron, after the war, decided to stay in the United States to wrap up his affairs, which was probably a very civilized way of saying that he met and married a very lovely Virginia girl. Now, one summer night in 1784, Captain Cameron was wandering through these woods with one of his servants, and they got hopelessly and gloriously lost. Now, as nightfall was coming on, a storm was rolling in. Captain Cameron and his servant were, like I say, hopelessly lost, looking around for any sign of life. They found nothing. Lightning was rolling in. They crossed a stream, made their way up to some farmland, and in the distance saw just the glimmer of a house. Now, a little bit of light flickering out the front door. Captain Cameron walks up to the front door and pounds on it, looking for shelter from the storm. The door opens, and who should it be but John Champe. Now see, the really ironic thing about all of this is that after Champe deserted from the United States Army and entered the British service, he was put into the company of one Captain Cameron, the very same man who several years later would be standing on his doorstep. The next morning, Captain Cameron sat down at John Champe's table, and Champe told him the entire tale from beginning to end, Cameron being the one officer in the British Army that Champe found tolerable and whose opinion he respected. It was right here, on this very spot, in Loudoun County, Virginia, that John Champe's house formerly stood. This farm here was his farm. And it was to this spot that he returned after his discharge. After Washington sent him on his way, gave him a horse, it was to here that Champe made his way back. By the time he sat down with Cameron in 1784, he was already married, no children yet, but he shortly would have 6. But it was right here at this very spot. Now you can barely make it out. I'm gonna try and zoom in just a little bit here. You can barely make it out up over that rise. There's a small obelisk, a small stone obelisk out there that marks the site of John Champe's house. Unfortunately, this is private property, so I'm not gonna go hopping the fence to show you guys, but it was right out there that Champe retired to.